So I recently listened to an audiobook called The Escape Artist. It is not about a magician. It is the story of a man named Rudolf Verba, who was alive during World War II, was a Jewish man born in Slovakia, who was taken to Auschwitz, the German death camp, and who escaped Auschwitz. He and the man that he escaped with were the only Jews at that time who had escaped Auschwitz. They escaped and made it all the way back into Slovakia and ended up reporting on what they had seen in the death camp and was going on with the Holocaust. There was a Verba Wetzler report that went out to the nations after that. You can read about it online. It's really an amazing thing. And they think that that report ultimately helped to save 200,000 Hungarian Jews from the Holocaust. It's an amazing story. Really, really good book. The last section of the book talks about Rudolph's life after World War II. Kind of goes quickly through it, but there are some significant moments in his life after what happened in World War II. He died in 2006, but a couple of years before he died, in 2004, he was the star witness in a trial in Canada for a man named Ernst Zundel. Now, I hope you've never heard of Ernst, because Ernst had a publishing house that put out materials denying that the Holocaust had ever happened. There's quite a history of that over the years. You may or may not be aware of Holocaust denial being a thing, but it is a pretty significant thing, and he was publishing so much material that he ended up going to trial for what he was publishing. His publishing house put out such titles as Did 6 Million Really Die? The Truth at Last? And then another one called The Hitler We Loved and Why? So he was going to trial, and Rudolf Verba, who experienced this and obviously who'd wrote about it, the Holocaust, witnessed the atrocities that happened, was called as a witness. And he was happy to testify. And his hope was that this whole stream of Holocaust denial would get stamped out. Now, here's what's interesting about that. For someone who has suffered greatly, there's nothing worse than that suffering being downplayed or even forgotten. There's a reason that we have memorials to commemorate significant tragedies and events that brought about a lot of human suffering. There's a reason we have memorials for those things. There is an element of we want to learn from those events so that we don't repeat something like the Holocaust again. Absolutely, that's a part of it. But we also remember in order to show respect and honor and dignity to those who have suffered. It's a way of validating their suffering and saying that, yes, it was real and it was horrific what you went through. Now, I want you to think of the book of Lamentations this morning as a memorial to the suffering of the Jewish people in the year 587 BC with the destruction of Jerusalem. It's a recounting of what happened, a poetic recounting of what happened during this time. And as we take a look at this memorial, as we walk through this memorial and view what happened over the next few weeks, you and I are going to learn how to respond to difficulty and to hardship and to suffering. And we're going to learn how to help those who are experiencing difficulty and suffering and who are grieving something that they've lost as well. Zach read the first poem in this book, Lamentations chapter 1. And I'll just remind you real quickly that all 5 of the chapters in this book are individual poems. It's beautifully structured. You can go back and listen to last week to hear about all of this. But Lamentations 1 is a poem. It stands on its own, but it also connects to the other poems in the book. And this particular poem, you may have noticed this when Zach was reading it this morning, but it's written from 2 different perspectives. There are 2 voices that you're going to hear that are both talking about the suffering of the city of Jerusalem and the Jewish people. And they're coming at it from sort of an outside angle and from an inside angle. And we'll talk about those voices as we go through this. So here's what we're going to see this morning in Lamentations 1. The title is Seeing the Suffering. We're going to see two perspectives on suffering, and then there's a little bit more to that title there that I want to give you. Two perspectives on suffering that teach us how to respond, okay? So it's not just that we want to see the suffering. That is a part of it. We'll talk about that. But we want to learn how to respond, and we want to learn how to respond as those who are grieving and suffering, and we want to learn how to help those who are grieving and suffering. And so at the end this morning, I'm going to go through application points for both of those groups of people, for the ones who are grieving and for the caregiver, the one who is helping the person who is grieving. This first section and this first voice that we're going to read here is in verses 1 through 11, and I've called it the poet's perspective. And here's what he is doing here. He is surveying the loss. He's looking out and describing what has been lost. Now, why do I call it the poet's perspective? Well, it's obviously poetry in this book, but we need to talk about who wrote this particular book of the Bible in this section. Most people think it's the prophet Jeremiah because he was there at the destruction of Jerusalem, and the history of the church has often paired his little book, or his prophetic book of Jeremiah, with this little book of Lamentations. The book actually never mentions him as the author. It is most likely the case that he was the author, but it never mentions it. This first section here is written by probably Jeremiah, but some poet who is observing what has happened, but is writing about it sort of at a distance and describing the events at a distance. He's there and he's witnessing it, but he's also looking at it from the outside. And what does he see? Well, he sees a woman who has been widowed and who is sitting alone, who is crying, and who has lost everything. Look again at verses 1 and the first part, verse 1 and the first part of verse 2. How lonely sits the city. You can see the imagery here that was full of people. How like a widow has she become? He's picturing Jerusalem as a woman who is sitting alone and who is widowed. She who was great among the nations, she who was a princess among the provinces, has become a slave. And look at the first part of verse 2. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. It's a rather stunning image when you picture this in your mind. A widow sitting alone at night and crying with tears streaming down her cheeks. And it is interesting that he describes her sitting alone at night because night is often the time when grief gets us, doesn't it? Very picturesque. Notice in verse 1 the three contrasts that are made here. And this sets us up for the rest of his narration in verses 1 through 11. This is what he's doing. He's describing the before and the after. What Israel had, what Jerusalem had, and what Jerusalem lost and where they are now. Look at the three contrasts here. Lonely, how lonely sits the city that was full of people. Quite a contrast there. Full of people versus lonely. Secondly, a widow versus someone who is great among the nations. There was no one in this culture more destitute and more on the outs than a widow who had lost her husband, her family. She had no other option. And that's what Jerusalem is here. And lastly, he presents her as a princess who was a princess, and now she has become a slave. All of this sets the stage for the incredible loss that Jerusalem has experienced. It's a before and after, and that's going to continue all the way through the end of his section at the end of verse 11. This whole section is about what has been lost. So with that in mind, this section, surveying the loss, let's stop and think about that for ourselves here. What causes grief? What's going on when you experience grief? It's the recognition that something has been lost. There's a before and there's an after the loss. And when we think about biblical lament, which is one of the points of this book, it's to teach us how to lament. When you think about biblical lament, a major part of Praying a prayer of lament is acknowledging and articulating to God what has been lost. It's saying it. It's voicing it. It's acknowledging the before and it's acknowledging the after. And it's coming to grips with and recognizing the pain that goes with the loss that has been experienced. And so throughout this speech that the poet's giving in verses 1 through 11, he's going to focus on what has been lost. And he gives us a whole bunch of things that have been lost in this section. In verses 2 through 6, he talks about the loss of people and of community. In verse 2, look at what it says here. Among all her lovers, and we'll talk about that picture here later in the chapter, she has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. She has no one to comfort her at all. Think about that for a second when it comes to grief. I know that I've heard many of you, when you experience a tragedy and when you've lost something, one of the things you will tell me is the most helpful part of this has been the church reaching out. It's been the community that has said, I love you, we're praying for you, and has expressed concern, has sent cards. It's the realization that there are still people you're connected to who love you despite the loss. There's nothing worse than feeling alone while you're suffering. That's exactly the situation that Jerusalem is experiencing. The loss of people, the loss of community, the loss of relationships. Look at verse 3. The poet here uses the language of Israel being in bondage in Egypt, and it's a reversal of that. Israel was in bondage in Egypt, and then God brought them out to peace and rest. And now he's saying Israel was in peace and rest in the land, and now they have been exiled from the land. They lost what God had previously given to them. Look at verse 3. Judah has gone into exile because of affliction and hard servitude. Those are the exact words that are used in Exodus to describe Israel's situation in slavery in Egypt. Continue in verse 3. She dwells now among the nations, but finds no resting place. Her pursuers have all overtaken her in the midst of her distress. It's a reversal of what happens before, or what has happened to them before. Look at verse 4. It describes the absence of people coming to the city. The roads to Zion mourn, for none come to the festival. All her gates are desolate. Her priests groan. Her virgins have been afflicted, and she herself suffers bitterly. Verse 5 laments the loss of her children. Her foes have become the head. Her enemies prosper because the Lord has afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions. Her children have gone away, captives before the foe. So she's lost the throngs coming in to worship. She's lost her children. She's lost her friends. Verse 6, even her leadership has deserted her. From the daughter of Zion, all her majesty has departed. Her princes have become like deer that find no pasture. They fled without strength before the pursuer. It's quite overwhelming to read all of this at one time regarding what has been lost. All of the relationships, the social community, the people that are gone now. Isolation and loneliness belong to this widow, Jerusalem. Then in verses 7 through 11, now the poet turns and begins to describe the loss of material possessions that Israel and Jerusalem experienced. And with the loss of material possessions, he begins to describe the guilt and shame that oftentimes come with grief. Look at verse 7, describing the material possessions. Jerusalem remembers in the days of her affliction and wandering all the precious things that were hers from days of old. When her people fell into the hand of the foe and there was none to help her, her foes gloated over her. They mocked at her downfall. Look down at verse 11, the first part there. All her people groan as they search for bread. They trade their treasures for food to revive their strength. Jerusalem has lost her material possessions and laments that as well. But notice also here in verse 8, we begin to get a description of what is behind the suffering and the shame that goes with it. Look at verse 8. Jerusalem sinned grievously, therefore she became filthy. All who honored her despise her, for they have seen her nakedness. She herself groans and turns her face away. It's a rather graphic picture when you read this. So earlier in the chapter, Israel was described as having lovers. She had pursued idolatry with other gods. They're described as her lovers, other nations, and they are deserting her now. And now this pictures her as sinning grievously and becoming filthy because of her promiscuity. And now she sits naked in her shame because of her sin. And the only thing she can do is turn away when people pass by and look at her. She doesn't want to see them see her in her shame and her grief. Look at the beginning of verse 9. Her uncleanness was in her skirts. She took no thought of her future. Therefore, her fall is terrible. She has no comforter. But you may have noticed as Zach read this, in verse 9, the last phrase there, someone else breaks into the narrative. This is the second voice that we're going to encounter in this first chapter here, and this is the city woman, Jerusalem. So the poet has been picturing Jerusalem as this widowed city, this widowed woman, and now she speaks into the middle of this. She hears the poet describing her shame and her grief and her sin and her loss, and she interjects into the middle of that in verse 9. Look there at the second half of verse 9. O Lord, behold my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed. What does she do here? And this gets to the heart of lament. So if you're going to understand lament, you have to understand what she does here. She wants God to see her in her suffering. That's the most important thing. God, don't ignore me. Everyone else is ignoring me. Everyone else seems to have passed me by. But God, don't shun me. Don't ignore me. Don't forget about me. And that verse 9, her interjection there, that sets us up for verses 12 through 22, which is where she speaks in the rest of the chapter. But before we get there, verse 10 returns to the poet. Look what he says. It's a shocking picture of Jerusalem's suffering. The enemy has stretched out his hands over all her precious things, for she has seen the nations enter her sanctuary, those whom you forbade to enter your congregation. So I don't want to get too graphic here, but this is in the language of what's happening here. This is comparing Jerusalem to a widow. And the indictment earlier was that she's gone after other lovers in idolatry. Now they won't comfort her. Instead, what is picturing that has happened here is the city has been entered into and the nations have gone into the sanctuary of the Lord. These other nations. And so what the poet is describing here is the rape of the city and of the temple. That's how bad it's gotten here for Jerusalem. So what do we have in this first perspective? Verses 1 through 11. We have a poet who is articulating the loss, and it's a horrific and emotional scene. But here's what I want you to hear about this scene too. It's very straightforward and honest. And this is so helpful for us in lament. There's a reason that the language is so graphic and it's so deep. And the emotional response to it is shame and shock and awe. It's straightforward and honest. We've seen the second voice, the city woman, cry out for God to see her in her suffering. She wants him to see everything that's happened and see her as she is. Look at verse 11 as it continues. All her people groan as they search for bread. They trade their treasures for food to revive their strength. Look, O Lord, and see, for I am despised. Now she takes center stage. And her request is that God would see her. So this is the city woman's perspective in verses 12 through 22. See my suffering. This is what she wants. Look at verse 12. Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look and see if there is any sorrow like my sorrow, which was brought upon me, which the Lord inflicted on the day of his fierce anger. So it's interesting, the progression here in verses 9 and 11, she asks the Lord to see her. And then in verse 12, she asks everyone who passes by to see her. It's as if she's already asked God to see and God hasn't responded. Now she turns to everyone else and asks everyone else to see her in her suffering. So let's talk about the fact that God hasn't responded to her yet, because I think this is helpful for us when we're in the middle of grief and suffering, and we're crying out to God, God, don't you see me in my suffering? I don't want to spoil the rest of the book, but God never responds in the book of Lamentations. Yes, there are some hopeful words in Lamentations chapter 3, but those aren't words that come directly from God. They're the poet or the narrator remembering words that God has said in the past. God doesn't say a word in the rest of the book of Lamentations. It's not like Job. Job laments, Job suffers, he talks about it, and then God, we have like 4 chapters of God speaking directly to Job and explaining a whole bunch of things. But he doesn't do that in the book of Lamentations at all. The entire focus here is on the articulation of the pain and what it looks like to lament. And so I think what this tells us is there may not be an immediate response from God in the midst of the suffering and of the grief. And that's okay. It doesn't mean he doesn't see. It doesn't mean he doesn't care. We'll obviously talk about that quite a bit as we go through the book. So as we start to look at her request that God see her, that others see her, let me remind you of what lament is. She is lamenting here. Lament is a prayer in pain that leads to trust. That's the most basic definition of lament. A prayer in pain that leads to trust. And for this prayer to lead to trust in God, it has to be honest with God about what has been lost, about how I feel, and honest with God in what role He has played in this. And again, this gets to a key component of lament as well. The recognition that God is sovereign, that He's ultimately in charge of all of this. We have to reckon with that. And that's what she does here. Look at verses 13 through 16. Notice how often it ascribes what has happened to God. Verse 13, from on high He sent fire into my bones. He made it descend. He spread a net for my feet. He turned me back. He has left me stunned, faint all the day long. My transgressions were bound into a yoke, but by His hand they were fastened together. They were set upon my neck. He caused my strength to fail. The Lord gave me into the hands of those whom I cannot withstand. The Lord rejected all my mighty men. You can see over and over again, the Lord is the one that Jerusalem is describing as having done this work. Verse 15, the Lord rejected all my mighty men in my midst. He summoned an assembly against me to crush my young men. The Lord has trodden as in a winepress the virgin daughter of Judah. And then the emotional response here in verse 16 to that. For these things I weep, my eyes flow with tears, for a comforter is far from me, one to revive my spirit. My children are desolate, for the enemy has prevailed. She recognizes God's role in this. She says He's sovereign. He's the one who is doing this work. And at the same time, she's also coming to grips with her own role in the suffering through her sin. Verse 17 now finds the poet breaking back in. So you've had the woman in verses 12 through 16, and now the poet breaks back in verse 17. Zion stretches out her hands, but there is none to comfort her. He's summarizing what she said so far. The Lord has commanded against Jacob that his neighbors should be his foes. Jerusalem has become a filthy thing among them. Then in verse 18, I think this is the key to understanding her whole message. Verse 18, the Lord is in the right, for I have rebelled against His word. But hear, all you peoples, and see my suffering. My young women and my young men have gone into captivity. So I think this is the key, and it's very helpful because the city acknowledges that her sin is behind the suffering. So there's a little bit of movement here to say, yes, I'm partially responsible for this, and yet, at the same time, she asks for people to see her in her suffering. She doesn't say, well, I'm behind it, therefore it's not real suffering. It's not real grief that I'm experiencing. She still wants people to see what is behind it. And so I think what this is teaching us is that the reason for this lament, her sin, is not the entire point here. It's to give voice to the grief of the situation. That's what's going on here. Let me read you what one author said about this. Here we make contact with an angst which is at the very heart of Israelite religion with its uncompromising monotheism. For if there is but one God who is sovereign over all things, no final explanation for anything is possible other than that he is behind it. And there is nowhere else to run but into the arms of the very one whose anger you have aroused. This means that if there is to be any hope of recovery at all, protest must sooner or later give way to repentance and supplication. There's this tension here that we talked about last week. God is sovereign, and yet at the same time, the sovereign God who's in control of everything is the one who I have to run to for hope and for help in the midst of the difficulty. And he talks here in this quote about the movement toward recovery and toward coming to grips, and I think that's what you start to see at the end of this chapter, particularly in verse 18. She acknowledges that the Lord is in the right and that she's rebelled against him and still is experiencing grief and wants people to see that. Yet she knows at the same time that the only way to find help is to go to the Lord. Look at verses 20 to 22. Look, O Lord, for I am in distress. My stomach churns, my heart is wrung within me, because I've been very rebellious. In the street the sword bereaves, in the house it is like death. They heard my groaning, yet there is no one to comfort me. All my enemies have heard of my trouble. They are glad that you have done it. You have brought the day you announced. And then look at this. Now let them be as I am. Let all their evil doing come before you, and deal with them as you have dealt with me, because of all my transgressions. For my groans are many, and my heart is faint. When I read those words in verses 20 to 22, I have to ask this question for us. What is the ultimate cause of suffering in the world? Why do you lose a loved one? Why do you have a terminal disease or chronic pain? Why do families break apart? Why do we have wars and famine? People don't have enough to eat, natural disasters. Why do we have every single kind of human suffering? I think this is what the city woman here is getting at by acknowledging that she has sinned and the Babylonians have sinned. She knows she's sinful, but she also says, but they've sinned too. Why do we have suffering? Let me give you a quote. These first two chapters of Lamentations remind us that sin is far more sweeping than just our individual experience. Our collective rebellion against God surfaces in our culture, families, cities, and nations. There are systemic problems within the fabric of our humanity that can be traced to a fundamental brokenness in the world. Minor key prayers remind us that brokenness has made its way in every part of our humanity. And you should feel that as you read this chapter this morning. Oh, this is awful. It is awful. It's horrific to read this. It's graphic. It's stunning. It's terrible to read about what happened to Jerusalem and to experience what happened. And this acknowledgement that sin is ultimately behind all of the suffering. My sin, not individual, my sin causes this situation for you or me necessarily. You can't tie every sin to some specific suffering that you're experiencing. But the point here in this chapter is sin is behind all of the suffering. And this is why lament is necessary. And if you never lament, if you never look out at the world and go, oh man, this is awful. What's going on? The suffering that I'm experiencing and that others are experiencing is terrible. If you never do that, and you never talk to God about that and never complain to God about that in any way, you're not being truthful about the world we live in. And that's why lament is necessary. Because lament says the honest truth about the world we live in. It's broken. It's not as it should be. It shouldn't be like this. You shouldn't suffer like you do. The whole thing is tilted. It's out of alignment. It's sick. It's diseased. And we all participate in it. We all contribute to it. And part of lament is coming to grips with sin in the world and my own brokenness. And so this chapter is lament, and it's one big recognition of brokenness. It brings it full in front of our face, and we have to stare at the fact that things aren't as they should be. There's so much pain and horror and loss and grief, and it's all because of sin. And you have to get there in your recognition of how the world works and of how things are, because if you don't get there, then there really is no hope. Because hope comes because the fundamental reason for suffering in the world has been dealt with. Not to get too far ahead of ourselves here, and not to jump to chapter 3, or not to jump past it into the New Testament, but the fundamental problem of sin was dealt with on the cross. And victory over sin and suffering and death was accomplished through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And you have to stare this full in the face from time to time. You won't appreciate the hope, and you won't appreciate the work of Christ and what he's accomplished on the cross and in the resurrection. Now, getting back to what we've seen here of the description, surveying the loss, and of the city woman asking God to see her in her suffering, I want to end this morning by offering you a couple of points of application. Hopefully this will help you as you think about your grief in your own life, loss in your own life, and then of helping others. So I'm going to divide this into two categories. I told you this: help for the one grieving, and then help for the caregiver or the one who is helping the one who is grieving. Okay? I'm sure we've all been in both of these categories over the years. First of all, for the one who is grieving, that describes you this morning. If you read some of the words of the city woman here and you're like, I have been like that, or I'm currently like that. Lord, I wish you would see me in my suffering because I'm experiencing. If that is you, or if that becomes you in the future, make an honest recounting of what you have lost. That's lament. The changes that have happened. Articulate what has been lost. Tell it to God. That's what's being modeled for us here. It's not haranguing at God. It's not screaming at him. It's a prayer of faith, but it's an honest recognition of what has been lost and coming to him with that. Tell him. So that's for the one grieving. For the one who is giving care to the one who is grieving. If you find yourself in a situation where your friend has just experienced loss, what can you learn from this? Listen and allow the struggle. Both of those things are there. Verse 12, where the city woman cries out, "Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look and see. Is there any sorrow like my sorrow, which was brought upon me?" Verse 20, "Look, O Lord," and then the description of the emotional and physical distress. Listen to your friend or your loved one articulate their pain. Let them be honest and acknowledge that there will be a struggle in this. Okay? So I'll be honest with you, it's a little hard to prep to teach through this. I like to go verse to verse as I teach, and it's a little hard because this is kind of all over the place. I was texting Bethany on Friday, like, this is a disaster. And that's because lament and grief and suffering are so all over the place. There's a acknowledgement of my own wrongdoing. There's a wishing that the Lord would see. There's a recounting of the pain. I mean, it's everywhere, all over the place. It's a struggle to lament and to deal with this. It's not clean, is the way I would say it. And so as someone who's giving care to a person who's grieving, listen. Allow them that freedom to go back and forth. to go be up and down, to struggle a bit with. We have inspired scripture that presents this city as struggling with what has happened. So allow that as a caregiver. For the one who's grieving, let's go back over there. Recognize the emotions that are at work in you. This chapter is filled with language of emotions. I made a list of all of the emotions in my notes studying for this, expressions of emotions and of how it describes Israel's grief and struggle. And it's shocking how many words in this chapter describe emotional responses. So learn to recognize what you're feeling in response to the loss. For the caregiver, flip back over there. I think 5 times in this first poem, the lack of comfort is mentioned as being a great distressor for Israel in her suffering. The problem here, one of the major problems she experienced, was social isolation. And so this tells us that people need connection in the midst of suffering. They need others to help them. They need a listening ear. They need physical presence that loves them. So don't run away. Run toward someone who's in their grief and be okay with some awkward moments, because they're going to be awkward moments. But be there, be present. Try to help them just by loving on them in that moment, because it's presented here as that's what Israel really needed. Now, for the one grieving, let's go back and finish there, okay? Chapter 1 moves in a direction. We talked about lament is a prayer in pain that leads to trust. Lament moves in a direction. It doesn't rush the direction, and this chapter doesn't give us they're not fully there, but you can see the movement here from articulating the pain to acknowledging that, yes, Jerusalem played a role in this, to acknowledging that sin is behind all of it ultimately. There's movement toward trusting in the Lord. And it progresses. This movement happens because the city speaks honestly to God and longs for His acknowledgement and His help. And so expect that progression and long for that progression, and learn to include prayers of faith in your lament, that God is to be trusted and is to be hoped in. And expect that He will work in your heart as you lament and as you grieve and as you pray too. So, those are a few application points here to help us, both those who are grieving and those who are giving care in the midst of your help and of your suffering, and of the help you're offering to those who are suffering. So take those, meditate on them, go back over this chapter. A lot of powerful things here. Really, in some ways, we've only been able to scratch the surface, but I hope that's helpful to you. Let's pray.